and you should have pop-ups. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Tuesday night's speaker series for our White Collar Support Group. Our guest tonight is Peter Tomasek, and I'm going to put his bio in the chat right now, and then I'll tell you how we're going to run tonight. Let me just get it in there, get it in the chat. So we are honored to have you tonight, Peter. Thank you. Peter is a practicing attorney in North Carolina, and also is the editor and chief of Interrogating Justice, which he's going to tell us all about, which is a relatively new criminal justice organization, but it's already doing fantastic work, based in New York, I think, but probably a lot of remote workers all over the place and doing all kinds of cool stuff. So he's going to talk about that. And we're very happy to have him talking tonight about what's going on in the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice, early release, the First Step Back, CARES Act, all that stuff that people are really interested in right now. If either you are in the midst of a justice issue, or you have a loved one or a colleague or someone who is. And so a lot of this is in the news, but Peter's going to kind of drill down into some of it. After Peter speaks for 30, 40 minutes, no timer, Peter, so you can just go as long as you want. Then we'll open it up to anybody who'd like to either share or ask questions of Peter. And we'll run it till about 8:30 or so, and we'll see how we're doing by then. So we are recording right now, and I am going to turn it over to Peter. And Peter has a multimedia presentation he's going to be putting on tonight, which is very exciting. And I've seen the slides already, so I can tell you that it's a lot of great information. So Peter, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks for having me here. I'm going to try to talk as I screen share, and I'm not sure that I have the skill set to do that, but we're going to find out. All right, can you guys see the PowerPoint slides? Very cool. Before I get into that, though, I'll just briefly kind of introduce myself and go through my background. As Jeff mentioned, I'm a lawyer, and now I'm the editor-in-chief for Interrogating Justice. A little bit about my background. I have kind of a weird background. I was given a presentation last week with Richard McDonald, as a matter of fact. And when I was the way that I describe my background is there was a day I used to live in Michigan, and there was a day when in the morning I went to an ICE detention facility with a client that I was representing, who handed me the keys to his car, the cash in his pockets, and a handful of other things that he wanted me to give his family because he believed he was going to be deported when he went into the office that day. After that, I drove, an hour and a half or whatever, and then I represented a multi-billion-dollar industrial gas company in a motion for summary judgment. And so that pretty much touches on everything you could imagine in the legal system. A lot of my work has focused on legal malpractice cases. So I've represented judges and lawyers in some pretty interesting cases. And all of those experiences together have just led me to both really, really value the law. I've always wanted to be a lawyer, so that's something I really care about. But also want the profession that I've devoted my life to meet the standards that it says it does. And I think that's going to play a significant part sort of in the stuff that I talk about today. As for Interrogating Justice, if I had to give kind of an elevator pitch for what Interrogating Justice is, it's basically two organizations, or two parts of the same organization, I guess. Interrogating Justice and How-To Justice. How-To Justice kind of does two different things. First, we give sort of basic information to people about the legal system. Want to make it easy to understand, easy to read, easy for a cell phone. And then the second aspect of how-to justice is connecting people with the resources they need. So maybe it's something like this group. Maybe it's, you just got released from prison and you're looking for housing, a bunch of different examples, but we know that there are a lot of people that are looking for good help and a lot of organizations that are providing good help. And we're just trying to bridge the gap between those two. And so that's how-to justice. Interrogating justice is a little more big picture. That is your analysis, trying to fix policy, trying to just raise awareness of issues. And that's sort of what gets me into the First Step Act. That is the primary thing that I'm going to talk about tonight. And it happens to be something that I feel very strongly about and spend most of my professional time on, the First Step Act time credits program. And so I'm just going to jump in. I'm sure a lot of you already know the United States incarcerates a lot of people. I think a lot of us know that the US has the highest incarceration rate in the world. I think it's kind of interesting when you look at the top 10 there. We incarcerate 629 people out of 100,000. Not only is that the highest in the world, but it's significantly ahead of Rwanda, the second highest in the world, which is only a little bit above the countries behind it. What a lot of people, I think, kind of take for granted is that also means that we incarcerate the most people, period. Even countries with significantly higher populations than ours don't incarcerate the number of people that we do. And when you incarcerate that many people, you have to pay for it. And in the United States, it's not cheap to incarcerate people. In 2019, the annual estimated cost was around $35,000. In 2020, it was $40,000 a year. I'd guess 2022, that number is probably close to $50,000, if not maybe a little bit higher. I like to break it down per day. So I would say about now it's probably around $150 a day. The way that I'll compare that is, so I'm getting ready to go to Cleveland for my son's hockey tournament this weekend, and the hotel that we got, where it's overpriced through a middleman for the hockey tournament, it's $160 per day. So that's a lot of money. And if you kind of extrapolate that, I did a little bit of multiplication there on the slide where you're multiplying that by how many people the BOP has behind bars every day. You're looking at a ton of money. It's millions of dollars every day. And so the way that I like to look at it is, I'll skip to this one, is, are we getting the bang for our buck? And I'm smart enough to go back. To me, the answer to that question seems to be no. I think it's kind of fascinating just to compare the states that have the highest incarceration rate with the states that have the highest crime rates. You look at Louisiana, for example, they have the highest incarceration rate in the country, but then they also have, hold on a second, I have the second highest crime rate. You look at Oklahoma, where it's number 3 in incarceration, number 6 in crime, Arkansas, number 5 in both. There's clearly a disconnect there with the incarceration. We're not getting what we're supposed to be getting out of it. And so, I tend to ask, like, what can we do to get a little bit more bang for our buck? And one of the things that we can do is legislation like the First Step Act. The First Step Act did a lot of good things, and I don't want to look over some of them in exchange for the one that I want to focus on. So it was narrowing mandatory minimum sentences in certain areas, getting rid of stacking provisions, addressing the crack versus powder cocaine disparity. All of those are super important. And that's why, it led people to call it the most significant criminal justice reform legislation in a generation. But something that the First Step Act also did was implement this time credits program. And so that's kind of where I'm going to focus tonight. And I'm guessing this is something that at least some of you are pretty familiar with. The idea behind the time credits program is pretty simple. For every 30 days of participation that someone has in evidence-based recidivism reduction programming or productive activities, you can earn 10 and usually 15 days off of your sentence. It doesn't take a mathematician to know that's a pretty good deal. It's a good deal for somebody in BOP custody and their family outside because you can get out of prison sooner. But I think it's also a good deal for taxpayers because you're getting out sooner and saving money by participating in the evidence-based recidivism reduction programming and productive activities. Also, at least on paper, you're becoming less likely to commit another crime, which is obviously a benefit too. And so when I look at that, like that's kind of a win all the way around. That would be a good example of us getting a little bang for our buck. One of the best things about the way that Congress designed the time credits program in the First Step Act is that it broadly defined what types of programs and activities fit into the definition of those. I don't necessarily feel the need to read those definitions to you, but they're super broad. I'm guessing if you're reading them right now on this slide, you're probably thinking, it feels like a lot of the programs and activities that you participate in prison would probably meet the definition. And I think you're probably right. Even as the First Step Act time credits program has sort of developed, and as messy as the implementation has been, the DOJ has seemed to buy into the idea that these definitions are broad. You're looking at prison jobs, Unicor, like all these sorts of things. Most of the time, BOP and DOJ officials agree that they meet the definitions. And so that makes it even more lucrative for someone in prison because it's fairly easy to earn these time credits. That's why, and I'll kind of get into this a little bit later, but a new rule that they announced in January, they made it so for your 30 days of participation, it's simply, did you have a program or activity on that day? With the idea being at the end of every month, we can just count those days rather than the hours or the minutes or whatever that you participated in the activities. So these broad definitions made it a pretty good deal. But then you get to the BOP taking something that was a pretty good deal and making it way more complicated than it needed to be. I won't dive into like the dates too much, but the way the statute was written out, I mean, it literally used the phrase phase-in period. The idea was that the time credits program would be phased in, implemented over the course of several years, starting the day that President Trump signed the First Step Act in December of 2018. The BOP looked at that phase-in period and said, no, actually, we are going to phase it in, but not give out any time credits until the very last possible day. And when I mean the last possible day, I mean, say, I think it was 3 or 4 steps along the way. The BOP officials took until the very last day at all 4 of those stages. And so that meant that for the most part, no one was earning any time credits until January 15th, 2022. That became known as the sort of the magic date that everybody was waiting for. And so we'll fast forward to January 13th, 2022, 48 hours before the deadline that everybody kept telling us to wait for. And Merrick Garland issues a press release saying that the Bureau of Prisons has started transferring eligible people out of BOP custody and into supervised release and RRC, home confinement, and that it was going to, and that the DOJ and BOP were going to continue counting First Step Act credits on a rolling basis, beginning with the people who were scheduled to be released sooner. Now, when I read that, I was like, fantastic. Even though it took way too long, that is a very logical way to approach it. And not only did this logical announcement kind of come out that gave you, it was encouraging, but also that was when Attorney General Garland issued the new rule that made it clear that they weren't going to count credits like based on hours. They were just going to count on days. And there were several other provisions in that that really, like, it made it sound straightforward, practical, and that made it easier for BOP staff and people in BOP custody. So that was pretty significant. And what happened after that was, for a lot of people, it was great. The BOP counted their time credits. They applied those time credits to the sentence, and they released them from prison to home confinement, or from home confinement to supervised release, or some variation of that. But for a lot of people, it didn't go like that. Maybe they were checking on the BOP's inmate locator and they never saw the release date change. Or they saw the release date change, but it didn't change near as much as they thought it was going to. And so then they went to their case manager and they said, hey, like I've earned this many credits. Can you explain this to me? And the BOP staff they talked to had no idea. And that was a problem. There was several different ways, I guess, you could go about trying to fix that. You could be patient and just sort of wait and see. Not exactly the best approach, probably, if you want quick answers. Otherwise, you were stuck kind of going through the grievance process and then eventually federal court. And so I'm going to walk through what that sort of looked like in federal court at first. Up until January 15th, anytime someone filed a habeas petition saying, hey, I've earned time credits and it's time for me to be released, all but 2 federal courts said, no, you have to wait until January 15th because that's the last possible day that the BOP has to implement the system. Since that January 15th date has kind of come and went, I won't get into why I think that was a wrong interpretation of the law they were relying on. But that was what they went with. And that date passed. Even after January 15th, 2022 passed, some courts were still telling people who filed habeas petitions that they had to wait until January 15th, which is just extraordinarily perplexing to issue a decision in February, March, and April, telling people to wait until January. But nevertheless, that's sort of what happened. And then, let me see so that kind of transitions me into why this matters to me. I kind of mentioned earlier that my background is, at least in part, it's all over the law, but a lot of it is legal malpractice. And so I've spent a lot of time looking into conducts of attorneys, conduct of judges. And I've just seen how attorneys and judges and government officials operate in tons of different areas. And this has been unique to me. I could make the argument that BOP officials, DOJ officials, federal courts should be doing a better job because it's the morally right thing to do. This is what the law says. You should just apply it as written because we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath people. The same goes for like the representations that BOP officials make directly to people in their custody. They promise that, yes, you will get First Step Act time credits for these, and then they say no afterward. I think that's morally the wrong thing to do. I could also make the argument that financially it's the right thing to do. I kind of touched on it earlier where, in essence, the goal of the First Step Act is to get some people out of prison, to kind of reduce mass incarceration. That's going to save millions of dollars in taxpayer money. I think that's a good thing also. And then another way that you could look at it is, I think safety-wise, it's a good thing. That's kind of something I touched on before too, where like the idea behind evidence-based recidivism reduction programming is that evidence supports the fact that this programming makes you less likely to commit crimes. And if that's the case, that makes all of us safer. Same with productive activities. There's a lot of research showing that remaining productive in prison makes you less likely to commit crimes after prison too. So like all of those, I think, are logical arguments as to why these rules should be followed to a T. But I don't even think we have to wade into any of those. I think the main reason why it's important that the BOP does what it's supposed to under the First Step Act time credits program is because the law literally requires it. When I look at the justice system, the entire premise of the whole justice system is that if you broke a rule, there are consequences for doing that. And I don't understand how we can possibly believe in a justice system that doesn't hold the enforcers of those rules to the same standard. I'm about to get into a handful of cases where you'll see sometimes the judges ruling in these cases aren't even aware of the rules, the regulations, the case law that applies to them. And so that's something that drives me absolutely nuts. All right, so this is where I'm going to nerd out a little bit in case law. I don't know, hopefully you guys find it as interesting as I do. But I'm going to start with 3 good cases. So these are the 3 most recent beneficial cases when it comes to the First Step Act implementation. The first one is Dyer v. Fulgham. I think if you've heard of these, that's probably one that you've heard of. That was a pretty well-known one that was kind of going around BOP circles for a while. I'll kind of cut to the conclusion first and then walk through the case. But in that case, a federal judge in Tennessee granted Douglas Dyer's habeas petition and ordered the BOP to apply any of the First Step Act time credits he had earned that weren't applied to his home confinement sentence to his supervised release. That was the first decision, or maybe it's the second technically, to do that. And that's pretty significant because that means all those time credits that you've earned that didn't apply because the BOP dragged his feet for so long still would have a benefit to you. So kind of walking through the timeline, Mr. Dyer filed his habeas petition in December of 2021. And basically what he asked for was either the court to order the BOP to apply them immediately, or to order the BOP to compensate him for the time that he spent behind bars that he shouldn't have. While that was pending, that was when the January 13th, 2022 announcement and rule came out. So the BOP undoubtedly saw that, counted his credits, applied those credits, and released him. And so then the BOP would move to dismiss, saying that the claim was moot because he had got what he asked for. He had been released. But Mr. Dyer didn't accept that. He pushed back and had argued that because he was only released to home confinement under the CARES Act, and then only released from home confinement to supervised release because of a handful of, I'll do the actual math. So they only used 61 days of the time credits he had earned. He wanted credit for the 489 other days of time credits he had earned. And so that was why he asked for either those to be applied to a supervised release or to award financial compensation for them. Now, the BOP responded, and this is a response they've used in dozens of cases successfully, is that there's nothing you can do. You lost the time credits, but what can we do? We didn't let you out on time. You still can't shorten your supervised release. And this judge in Tennessee said no, and he applied 489 days of First Step Act time credits to a 3-year term of supervised release, which is a pretty significant chunk. And so you have that case, and then you have this Stewart v. Snyder case that I mentioned on there. This one's starting to get more attention because it happened to involve a very revealing declaration by a BOP official that showed up in the file that sort of made its headline, or made some headlines with like Walter Pavlo and Forbes and that sort of thing. But basically, Robert Stewart was in the same spot as Mr. Dyer, where he was on home confinement when a judge looked at his petition to get the BOP to order get the BOP to apply his First Step Back time credits. Mr. Stewart was looking for 135 days worth. That was the way that he calculated his time credits. And based on his 9 months of participation in the programs and activities I talked about before. And the BOP only awarded him 75. So he just wanted the additional 60. But the BOP had given him the 75, originally it gave him 61, but it gave him the first batch when it calculated everything there in December of 2021, right before it released the January 2022 rule. And so in response to Mr. Stewart's lawsuit, the BOP said he's going to have to wait until we recalculate again. And we don't plan to recalculate again until we get our auto calculation application prepared, which, if you've been following this kind of news at all, just got done recently. But that was the judge in his case, Judge England out of Alabama, said it exactly like that. He said, once an inmate's time credit is calculated, it will not be recalculated again until the implementation of the automated computation system. And so again, the BOP was just saying, just kind of sit and wait. Sorry if we hold you too long. But because Mr. Stewart was constantly earning First Step Back time credits, he was still accumulating more and more and more as time went on. And he wanted the BOP to be counting those because eventually he would hit the day to be released. And The BOP tried to say no, but Judge England pushed back on that too. He said, if Mr. Stewart has earned additional credits during this time, then they should be awarded to him and reflected in his sentence. So the judge ordered the BOP to apply any First Step Act time credits he had earned so far to his sentence as well. And then also ordered the BOP to recalculate his time credits every 60 days, which still an extra 60 days isn't great. But it's certainly better than nothing. And I think it's kind of cool where this case actually has a happy ending, where they released Mr. Stewart in July, and they just started using their auto calculation system. They say at the end of August. I would argue it was October, but either way, that saved him quite a bit of time from being in prison. And that leads me to a case I didn't put on the slide, but it's by far my favorite. I wrote an article about it for Interrogating Justice. If y'all want to go look at it after, it's called Lalave v. Martinez. And this is one where I get to pick on the BOP and federal courts because this case was a complete disaster. So the woman's name is Virginia Lalave. She filed a habeas petition asking the court to immediately or order the BOP to immediately apply her First Step Act time credits. But at the end of June, a federal judge in New York denied her petition based on her failure to exhaust administrative remedies. I wrote in the article at the time that, like, that's pretty ordinary. That if any of you all know something about habeas petitions, it's that if you don't exhaust your administrative remedies, courts probably aren't going to listen to them. But what was interesting about that decision back in June was that the judge also said that it didn't seem possible that Ms. Lalave could have earned enough time credits to be released. He said, as of the end of June 2022, approximately 5.5 months will have passed since the January 15th, 2022 deadline. Thus, at a minimum, petitioner could have earned just over 80 days of good time credit. Number one, I'll just point out he doesn't mean good time credit. He means First Step Act time credits. And then also the new rule that came out in January, so that would have been 6 months, give or take, before his decision, said that you go back to when the act was first passed, December of 2018, for the rules. And so I wrote an article that was pretty whiny about how it seemed like this judge was deciding this case, but didn't really know what rules even applied to it. Now, I thought maybe he just disagreed with it or whatever, but, you know, I'll take the chance to be snarky if I can. And so 3.5 months later, just, I guess last week, last week, he issued another decision, and he literally said, quote, or that he, quote, may have overlooked the BOP regulations specifying the timing of the application of FSA credits. How you can decide a case on applying FSA time credits without looking at the regulation specifying the timing of the application of FSA credits is beyond me. But he admitted it, which I'll give him credit for. It takes a lot for judges to admit when they were wrong, and he did it. And not only did he admit that he was wrong, or that he, quote, may have overlooked the regulation, but he also gave credits to Ms. Lalave for, quote, helpfully pointing it out, which I thought was kind of a good thing. And not only was it nice to see a judge admit they were wrong, and it's kind of complicated. I guess I won't get into like procedural quirks behind it. But he also wrote an opinion concluding that the BOP had violated the First Step Act by failing to award Ms. Lalave First Step Act time credits. And so, like the judge in Dyer, he ordered the BOP, and I'll just read the exact language, to award petitioner the FSA credits that she is entitled to, which should result in her immediate release to supervised release, and to apply the remaining credits to reduce her time on supervised release. So, I mean, that's another huge win. And so you put these cases together, we're starting to get a body of case law to support the suggestion that any unused First Step Act time credits that you've accumulated can be used to shorten a term of supervised release, which, while probably not as good as being released from, behind literal bars or home confinement, is still better than nothing, and frankly, better than you usually expect with the BOP. But now I'm going to tell you about a couple other cases that aren't so good news, but I think it's interesting to sort of juxtapose them against the ones I just talked about. So this one is called Zimmer v. Marski, and this is from Judge James D. Peterson in the Western District of Wisconsin. A few months after those decisions that at least Dyer, he issued a decision saying that he was prohibited by federal law from shortening terms of supervised release using First Step Act time credits. I'm guessing you're kind of wondering, well, how can one judge say one thing and one judge says the other? You're probably not wondering that if you have any experience in the legal system, but it still is weird to see the exact opposite conclusions from two judges. And so what I did was I went through the cases that Judge Peterson cited just to see if any of them actually supported what he was saying. So the first thing I'll point out is he cited 3 cases. None of them are from Wisconsin. And none of them are from whatever circuit court Wisconsin's in. And so none of them would be binding. But I'll still work through them anyway. So the first one was Wilson v. Sawyer. That's a 2020 Florida case in which a judge, to Judge Peterson's credit, that one did involve First Step Act credits. But in that case, the judge was talking about good time credits, which he said a federal regulation prohibits the application of good time credits to shorten the period of supervision, which is 100% accurate. Good time credits can't be used to shorten supervised release, but that has nothing to do with First Step Act time credits. And then he cited 2 other cases, Wilson v. Andrews, that one's 2020 from Virginia, Garland v. Johnson, that's 2019 from Louisiana. And both of those also held that good time credits cannot be used to shorten supervised release. But the only thing that those cases have in common with the one in Zimmer v. Marski was that they involved time credits of some sort, but they're completely different time credits. And the federal regulation that the Wilson v. Sawyer case talked about very clearly says good time credits. It was passed before passed isn't the right word. It was implemented before the First Step Act even exists. So there's no way that that could actually control the case that he was deciding. But that didn't stop him from ruling in the BOP's favor anyway. And that's kind of all she wrote on that case. And then the last one that I'll briefly touch on is a case called Ely v. United States out of Nebraska. And that is, as far as I can tell, the first case that someone has brought after being released to collect money damages for the extra time that they spent in prison because the BOP took so long to apply First Step time credits. So Michael Ely, he was incarcerated in FCI Forest City from July 30th, 2021 to February 8th, 2022. And he said that had the Bureau of Prisons calculated his time credits immediately like it should have, he would have been released for July 30th, 2021, instead of when he ended up being released, which was probably around January 2022. He wanted $360,000 in damages, which, I mean, although it's a significant sum of money, isn't outrageous. It seems like a fairly reasonable request on its face under the Federal Tort Claims Act. But U.S. District Court Judge Richard Kampf out of Nebraska dismissed the case and ruled that the BOP had no duty to release Mr. Ely until the January 15th, 2022 deadline. I would like to disagree with that, but I'm not going to get into that because it's probably a gray area. I know I had mentioned earlier that judges weren't really releasing people before January 15th, 2022 anyway, so it doesn't surprise me that he reached that conclusion. But what I thought was so interesting was that he said that the BOP had no duty to release Mr. Ely until January 15th, 2022, completely ignoring the fact that part of his claim was that he was illegally incarcerated until February 8th, 2022. Now, sure, we're just talking about 3 or so weeks, but I just think that's another crazy example of how his decision doesn't even address that at all. He just ignores the fact that there was 3 more weeks that Mr. Ely claims he was legally incarcerated for, and the decision doesn't even address. So those are kind of the main cases that I think are pretty interesting that are going on right now. Hopefully you guys found them as interesting as I did. Otherwise, that was probably a boring few minutes. But I'll kind of dip back into sort of where things stand now altogether. And then we can kind of go from there. So where things currently stand with the BOP, it's kind of a mess. Some of you may know last month the BOP posted an inmate message on federal time credits auto calculation launch. I guess first I'll say there are some good takeaways from that memo. One of the things that it announced was that the BOP was automatically counting First Step Act time credits every 30 days. That's fantastic. Like at least they're up to 30 days, so that's not too bad. But there are a couple things that really stand out from that decision too, or that memo too, that aren't so good. The first thing is that the memo states that people who refuse to participate in BOP recommended programs or activities will be considered to have opted out of First Step Act time credits. By itself, that's not too bad. I mean, it's kind of a tit for tat where you have to participate in the programs and activities to get the time credits. The problem is that we're already hearing from people in BOP custody who are saying that they were documented as having opted out because they didn't participate in programs that their facility doesn't even offer. So that's kind of turning into a debacle already. And then after that, and probably even worse, is that memo also included, it was the first public announcement that the BOP is going to limit First Step Act time credits to 365 days or until you have 18 months remaining on your sentence. I won't spend a lot of time on the 365-day limit because I actually think that's probably supported by law and wasn't particularly surprising. But the 18-month cutoff is because that means you cannot earn First Step Act time credits off your actual prison sentence once you're within 18 months of your release date. So kind of a different way to look at that is you have to spend at least 42 months in BOP custody to earn a full year of First Step Act time credits. It's hard for me to even understand the logic behind that. Not that the length of sentence in and of itself is indicative of the kind of crime you committed. I think we probably all know better than that. But it's still a factor. And the idea that people who are serving less than 42 months shouldn't even have an opportunity to earn their full amount of First Step Act time credits is kind of crazy. And then where do things stand in court? I kind of got into that already. Sort of a quick summary is if you don't exhaust your administrative remedies, your case is going to get dismissed. If you do exhaust the grievance process, there's a pretty decent chance that the BOP will release you, assuming your calculation is correct, while your case is pending. And then depending on what court you're in, you may or may not get the unused credits applied to your supervised release. I'll kind of give a quick endorsement to a podcast Richard McDonald and Fred Arend did the other day for Interrogating Justice with Christine Bunch. The podcast is called Justice Impacted. And in there, one of the things that Richard and Fred both talked about was how inconsistent the justice system is. There were examples of, my lawyer knew about this kind of plea agreement, but other people's lawyers didn't. One BOP official would let A, B, and C happen, but the other wouldn't allow it at all, those types of things. And the same thing is incredibly true for First Step Act time credits, where you just, whether or not those are going to apply to your supervised release depends entirely on the judge you happen to land in front of and whether they're aware of certain regulations, aware of case law, that sort of thing. And so that makes it kind of impossible to predict and also super unfair. I think the thing that frustrates me most is it's pretty simple. I mean, the First Step Act time, I kind of started by saying like the time credits program is extremely straightforward. The BOP is required to award these incentives to their specific class of prisoners who qualify. And federal courts all the time are issuing decisions saying that the BOP is required to do that. But instead of following that straightforward process, we've wasted a lot of time, we've wasted a lot of money, And now we're creating rules that are excluding the very people that I think Congress had in mind when they passed the First Step Act to begin with. And what I think is most challenging about this specific problem is that most of the people making these decisions are like low-level BOP staff that I don't know the names of, that most of you don't know the names of, maybe beyond if you know your own case manager, you may never hear these names at all. And so they don't have a lot of incentive for accountability. Which brings me to what might happen next. It's going to be a mess for a little while. I talked about the 18-month cutoff. That's a disaster. I think that there's been enough publicity on that hopefully the new BOP director, Colette Peters, will sort of hear that and kind of intervene. I don't know whether, I assume the memo is system-wide, but you never really know. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But what makes you even less confident, Walter Pavlo published an article for Forbes last week that talked about a lot of failures when it comes to the First Step Act. But one of the most alarming things in it was he had an exchange with an anonymous BOP case manager who said that not only had she not been trained at all on the First Step Act, which is alarming by itself, but that she didn't even know that the auto calculation application was up and running. I don't know how you can have much confidence in the BOP applying First Step Act credits if the people that are making the decisions don't even know the counting system works. And then, of course, I kind of mentioned at the bottom there, there are new federal court decisions coming out every day that haphazardly dismiss these petitions and don't even get into the real meat of the issues, which is absolutely cause for concern. But I also do have a little bit of optimism. I'll start with the new BOP director, Colette Peters. She has definitely talked the talk in her career during her time in the Oregon Department of Corrections. I don't know that I can say that she's walked the walk. I think that kind of depends on your perspective. But even if we're just improving the rhetoric and how we talk about people in BOP custody, that's better than nothing. Another thing that I'm pretty optimistic about, and it sort of personally involves me, is that there's a lot of discussion about potential legal avenues to challenge a lot of this. There's a handful of people that I'm talking with right now about individual lawsuits. Now that we're kind of armed with this new case law, have wealthier former prisoners who are willing to kind of pay to hopefully get even better case law out there to bring these issues to other judges' attention, to advocate strongly for these, which I think has a chance to make a difference and give us more precedent to work with. And then I also know personally, and I'm sure other people are involved in it too, I've been talking with some law professors about potentially a class action lawsuit over this topic too. It's tough because all these situations are different. The BOP seems to have a pretty good strategy of anytime somebody really, really noisy files a lawsuit, they just give them what they want and it goes away, and then the burden's on the next person to try to do the same thing. So we're at least considering it, and I think the more people that kind of get involved in this, the better. There's not a ton of people that are writing on this topic right now, and it's kind of lost the excitement and interest it had politically, which is a problem. But that kind of brings me to the last point, something's still better than nothing. I think about a few years ago when, and I'll leave politics out of it, but when Donald Trump won and we were in this super contentious political climate that really hasn't ended, if you'd have told me that we were going to pass something as significant as the First Step Act, and that we were actually going to see it take off and some people released because of it, I probably wouldn't have believed you. And so I do think it's important to kind of appreciate how far we've made it, all things considered. And that sort of leads me to where do we go from here? I'll sort of leave it as an intro, politics aside. I just think this is an interesting example. So on the day that President Trump signed the First Step Act, the Heritage Foundation published an article, and I like how Pro-Lies describes the Heritage Foundation as a pipeline of hate to the Trump administration. So that shows you kind of which side of the aisle people tend to think the Heritage Foundation falls on. And they called it a conservative victory, a historic victory, and a landmark bill that provides, important, modest, much needed prison and sentence reform that was modeled on red states. And I mean, that's obviously a super favorable description. Oops. And then the same article, gave credit to Mitch McConnell, obviously a well-known person in Republican circles. Senator Mike Lee, he's not exactly your most liberal Republican in office, former prosecutor, and he was one of the leaders on getting that passed. He described it as a huge win for America and President Trump, said it would lead to stronger families and safer communities. And they even Republicans or Donald Trump, I don't remember which, even promoted it in a Super Bowl ad. So, I mean, that's pretty hard endorsement of how positive the First Step Act was in conservative circles, which brings you to Tom Cotton, also a pretty well-known Republican, who called it a deadly mistake, the worst mistake of the Trump administration. A Fox News report got into how hundreds of violent criminals were released because of it. And I don't use these as examples to kind of like dunk on Republican, but I just think it's a good example of how challenging it is to get everyone on the same page when it comes to significant criminal justice reform. It was really, really tough to get the First Step Act passed in the first place. This time credits program, like when I look at it compared to the arguments that we're having in the political climate now, it's hard to imagine how it would ever be passed today. And so getting these things fixed, it's going to be tough. I think it's going to take a lot of work from currently incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, advocates, allies, politicians. And I'm not, I'm not sure if we can be optimistic or not, but I just think these types of kind of contradictory comments show what an uphill battle this is going to be. I've talked for quite a while, so I'm going to try to wrap up here pretty quick, but I was just going to touch on a handful of other things that are going on at the BOP. Compassionate release under the CARES Act. I know the other day President Biden made a comment that the pandemic was over. You may or may not disagree with that on sort of science and public health reasons, but that could mean the end of CARES Act compassionate release, which I think we all probably agree was a really beneficial thing. And so that's kind of tough to see that coming to an end. Another topic that I write down a lot is BOP book deals with private vendors. You have a lot of individual facilities right now that are requiring families and loved ones with people in the BOP facility to go through one specific vendor that usually overcharges and doesn't have a great collection of written, books and magazines. I'll cite back to Richard and Fred again on the podcast. They had talked about sometimes it seems like BOP officials are just kind of being petty, making rules just to make life a little bit worse for the families of people in BOP custody. And I think that would be a pretty good example of that sort of thing happening. And then the last thing, understaffing, corruption, and violence. I mean, we all know that the BOP is embroiled with tons of controversies. I think I regret not mentioning Frederick Bardell. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see that name, but it's worth Googling. There's a really good write-up by CJ Ciaramella and Reason about him. He was suffering from cancer and the BOP basically did nothing. He went to court, the court did nothing. He went back to court, the court ordered him to be released as soon as the probation department came up with a good release plan. The BOP said whatever and sent another BOP inmate to take him to the airport. He just dropped him off on the curb, had to take the wheelchair back to the BOP facility, obviously. And so it just left this man who was struggling with unbelievable cancer at the time, sitting on the curb at the airport. His family eventually got him home, and 9 days later he passed away. It's a pretty messed up story, and I think it's worth kind of reading. The judge in the case was pretty outraged about it, but his hands were sort of tied too, because a lot of these decisions are protected, and it's kind of crazy. But on that, I will wrap up. I probably went longer than the 30 or 40 minutes. Sorry about that. But hopefully that was kind of interesting, and I'm looking forward to kind of questions and discussion and stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was really wonderful. If you could take take it down, that's great. Thank you so much. We're going to stop the recording now, and then we're going to open it up to shares or questions. If you'd like to either share or ask a question, please put your name in the chat box, and I will call on you. And please keep your comments or your questions to 3 minutes or less, so we have enough time for everyone to share. So thank you again, Peter. It was really, really wonderful. I'm